Hello, this lecture covers the Great Depression in America. The collapse of the stock market in October 1929 was a stunning event in an era when optimism was high. For the United States, it was the most important economic event in the 20th century. Historian Paul Johnson argues that the Wall Street collapse in late 1929 and the subsequent depression made the Second War possible, though not inevitable, and by undermining confidence in the efficacy of the market and the capitalist system, they helped to explain why the absurdly inefficient and murderous system of Soviet communism survived for so long. The crash caused great trauma that lasted for years throughout America. Before 1929, depressions typically lasted for a year or two. When they happened, economists expected a contraction of prices and credit and the shutting down of unsound businesses. This would cause the temporary losses of jobs, followed by economic recovery. The recessions and severe economic crises of the past followed this pattern. 20th century examples include the years 1907, 1908, and 1910 to 1912, and 1920-21. However, 1929 was unique. The pattern of rebounding did not happen. The Great Depression that began, quote, in 1929 lasted in effect for 11 years. The intensity and duration of job losses were new. In past economic crises, unemployment rarely reached 10%. By 1931, unemployment rose higher than 20%, and it remained above 15% for the rest of the decade. Even in early 1940, it was still at 14.6%. Politicians throughout the 1930s and many later historians attempted to put a positive interpretation on the years after 1933, but the numbers do not lie. One scholar of the Austrian School of Economics wrote, quote, "When unemployment remains over 15%, it is folly to refer to the 1933-1937 period as prosperity. It is still depression, even if slightly less intense than in 1933. Historians would have to be creative to argue that the government intervention of the economy from 1930 to 1939 was a success. It is striking how modern historiography has failed to explain the intensity and duration of the Great Depression. At least in the beginning, the Wall Street crash itself was not remarkable. The bull market ended in early September 1929, and shrewder operators looked hard at the numbers. On October 21st, the ticker tape was unable to keep pace with the news of the economic fall. Speculators scrambled, aware of the possibility of losing their savings and homes. 3 days later, shares dropped vertically. No one was buying. 5 days later, October 29th, was Black Tuesday. Due to the unparalleled amount of speculation allowed by Wall Street, there had to be a severe stock market correction at some point. Buoyed by the good years of the 1920s, an increasing number of Americans had accounts with stock exchanges. Now, they were a minority as far as numbers who had accounts with stock exchanges, but certainly more than ever before. Of this number, there were about 600,000 speculators who traded on margin. In other words, they did not have the funds to back up their trading. Another issue that compounded margin trading was the mushrooming of investment trusts. On margin trading, Paul Johnson writes, traditionally, stocks were valued at about 10 times earnings. With high margin trading, earnings on shares were far less than the 8 to 10% interest on loans used to buy them. By 1929, some stocks were selling at 50 times earnings. A market boom based entirely on capital gains is merely a form of pyramid selling. And a capital gain is the increase of value of an asset over time. By mid-November, the immediate panic subsided. So if we look at the following month, looking into mid-November 1929, there was less panic. The index had dropped from 452 to 224, and that was a huge drop. But this was only 21 points lower than what it was in December of 1928. Some argue that in about 1 year, there would have been a natural adjustment or correction of the market. This, however, did not take place. The government, business, and the public lacked the patience necessary to wait out the storm. Paul Johnson explains, if the recession had been allowed to adjust itself as it would have done by the end of 1930 on any earlier analogy, confidence would have returned and the world slump need never have occurred. Economists continue to debate the cause of the Great Crash and an effective solution. Marxists and Keynesians point to free market capitalism as the problem. On the other hand, free market economists, such as representatives of the Austrian School of Economics, see monetary intervention in the market as the main culprit. The monetary theory argues that the banking system causes booms and busts with its money and credit expansion. Thus, in the 1920s, there was too much credit expansion that resulted in accumulation of malinvested capital. And this was someone else's term, malinvested capital. Again, historian Paul Johnson, mentioned earlier, supports this understanding. Historiography on the political response to the economic disaster is fascinating. A common interpretation is that President Herbert Hoover did not do enough to get America back on economic track. There is the claim that he failed to use the government to solve the economic problem. President Hoover's response, so the argument goes, his response to the conditions of the Depression gave little hope, and he was increasingly criticized by the people. The aloof and introverted Hoover appeared to be out of touch with the American people. So this is the interpretation of those who argue that he just did not do enough. Revisionist scholars suggest that there is one important component missing from this interpretation. They argue that Hoover overestimated the value of government planning. In other words, the problem was not that Hoover intervened too little, but that he intervened too much. His economic approach shared much with Roosevelt's approach, the next president, than later historians wanted to admit. In the 1930s, a Democratic supporter declared, "When it was all over, I once made a list of New Deal ventures begun during Hoover's years as Secretary of Commerce and then as president. The New Deal owed much to what he had begun." And this is the words of Democrat and FDR advisor Rexford Tugwell. The deepest problem with Hoover, the argument goes, was his lack of faith in the marketplace. Hoover unwisely did not support the idea of allowing wages to go down. Now, the argument, of course, I'm referring to free market historians, free market and free market economists who believed that Hoover just did not have enough faith in the marketplace. So they argued that he unwisely did not support the ideas of allowing wages to go down. By forcing wages to remain artificially higher than supply and demand dictated, people lost jobs. Another shortcoming of Hoover is that he signed the SmootHawley Tariff of 1930. Before he signed this tariff bill, over 1,000 American economists warned him about the damaging effects of such a tariff. They wrote, quote, "Our export trade in general would suffer. Countries cannot permanently buy from us unless they are permitted to sell to us, and the more we restrict the importation of goods from them by means of even higher tariffs, the more we reduce the possibility of our exporting to them." Well, these economists were correct. The tariff provoked retaliatory protectionist actions by nations all over the globe, depriving the United States of markets and sending the country into a deeper slump. At a time when the country could have pulled itself out of a slump through trade, Washington was buttressing the walls, preventing that trade. This is a quote. In sum, the interventionists, quote, Hoover had done damage on three fronts: intervening in business, signing into law a destructive tariff, and assailing the stock market. Economist Thomas Sowell makes an important point about the market, the money supply during Hoover's government. After the crash of 1929, the money supply fell by 1/3. It became impossible, Thomas Sowell writes, to continue to sell as many goods and hire as many people at the old price levels, including the old wage levels. However, if prices and wage rates had also declined immediately by 1/3, then of course the reduced money supply still could have bought as much as before, and the real output and employment could have continued. Now, there would have been the same amount of real things produced, just with smaller numbers on their price tags. so that paychecks with smaller numbers on them could have bought just as much as before. In reality, however, a complex national economy can never adjust that fast or that perfectly. So there was a massive decline in total sales with corresponding declines in production and employment. Certainly, the Hoover economy was bleak. The massive job losses and the dramatic decrease in industrial production and trade caused very real human suffering. It was the numbing shock of unemployment, quote, the loss of a lifetime's savings, the nagging fear of being thrown out of work, and the loss of confidence in self and in the nation that made the Depression such an ordeal, end of quote. Countless Americans faced physical and psychological hardship. The ever-increasing prosperity of the previous decade was gone. People wandered about, homeless and jobless. At least 1 out of every 4 Americans was without a job. Those who had a job saw their wages and hours reduced. The gross national product was $104 billion in 1929, and that number dropped to $72 billion 4 years later. People lack confidence in public institutions, business leaders, and even in themselves. One of the more graphic illustrations of American despair at the end of Hoover's administration was the plight of some war veterans. In 1931, Congress passed a bill that authorized loans up to 50% of the veterans' bonus certificates. In an address to the American Legion in September of 1931, Hoover stated that some individuals may have lost their nerve and faith, but the real American people are digging themselves out with industry and courage. We have the self-containment, the resources, the manhood, the intelligence, and by united action, we will lead the world in recovery. Within his speech, there was lofty rhetoric, but no effective economic solutions. In the following year, war veterans began to push for legislation that would permit them to receive full payment for their bonus certificates. Hoover successfully persuaded the Senate to reject such a bill. Still, veterans began their migration to Washington, D.C., demanding new bonus legislation. The Bonus March of 1932 was the beginning of what was to become the greatest challenge to Hoover's credibility. The march originated in Oregon when 300 unemployed veterans began their trek by rail to the nation's capital. At each city, this bonus army, so-called bonus army, gained new recruits and eventually received national attention. Historian Roger Daniels states that the march symbolized the essentially optimistic nature of the average American, an optimism that would impel him upon what was clearly a pointless pilgrimage, and a sort of mindless activism that insisted it was better to do something even if it turned out to be wrong. The bonus marchers' transcontinental trek was not just an act to demand bonus legislation, but it was also a flight from reality, a flight from hunger, from the cries of starving children, from the harsh rebuffs of prospective employers. The veterans came from all areas of America. Quote, lumberjacks from Oregon, ranch hands from North Dakota and Utah, coal miners from Pennsylvania, skilled mechanics from Ohio, stockyard workers from Chicago, cotton pickers from the South, clerks from the Middle West. Arriving in Washington, the so-called bonus expeditionary force set up a shanty village at Anacostia Flats. And this is just east across the Anacostia River. Although against their method, Hoover was not indifferent to their suffering. He provided secret assistance, permitting the veterans to temporarily occupy unused federal buildings and giving permission for the opening of a medical aid station. Clothing, tents, and kitchen supplies were also distributed free of cost. Hoover hoped that the veterans' enthusiasm would wear off and they would disperse on their own. In July, he quickly initiated a bill for transportation loans, and many veterans indeed took advantage of this opportunity to return home. But others arrived, including 250 Californians. Roy W. Robertson, their leader, quote, started them on a slow, shuffling march around the plaza that was to last 4 days, 3 nights, and such persistent picketing, all of this giving Congress a touch of the nerves. Trouble erupted when the government attempted to evict veterans from government buildings in the downtown areas. As police moved in, a riot broke out. The badly outnumbered police faced many veterans armed with clubs and bricks. Immediately, Hoover gave directions for General Douglas MacArthur to take charge. MacArthur and his troops dispersed the veterans in the downtown area and crossed over into Anacostia Flats, where a rout took place late into the night, including the burning of the camps. In the radical magazine, The Nation, a journalist wrote, quote, a command was given and the cavalry charged the crowd with drawn sabers. Men, women, and children fled shrieking across the broken land, falling into excavations as they strove to avoid the rearing hoofs and saber points. So we have quite sensational rhetoric in these radical left-wing literature. There was also the leftist New Republic, and it presented a similar assessment. Quote, whatever justification there may have been for clearing out the ex-soldiers from Pennsylvania Avenue, there is absolutely none of what followed at Anacostia, driving all of them cripples, babies, pregnant women up a steep hill at the point of a bayonet. End of quote. The magazine declared that, quote, it is profoundly humiliating to every American that he must see his government thus persecuting and stealing from these hungry and ragged men whom, 14 years ago, it did not hesitate to send into the trenches at the risk of death. Sensationalist reports damaged Hoover's image. Many fiscal conservatives among both Republicans and Democrats had opposed giving the veterans full payment of the bonus. Yet the Anacostia episode hurt Hoover's chances to regain another term in office. Hoover's administration continued to make many errors in its defense, including the theory that communist forces had been the major cause behind the riot. Hoover and his administration steadily lost ground. In November 1932, voters rejected Hoover handily, and they chose Franklin Roosevelt. As he began his presidency, Roosevelt sought to make corrective actions that would give an immediate balance to both the economy and the national spirit. He reassured the American people that the only thing they had to fear is fear itself, declaring his faith that, quote, "This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive, and will prosper," pledging direct, vigorous action. In his oath of office, Roosevelt pointed to the incompetence of business leaders. He established far-ranging policies that brought a level of government intervention never witnessed in American economic history. And we can see from the results of the 1932 election that Roosevelt had 57% of the popular vote versus 40% for Hoover. And the lopsidedness of the election was even more noticeable when you look at the electoral map. And of the electoral vote of 531, the Democrats, Roosevelt, had almost 90% of the electoral vote. In his first 100 days, Roosevelt ushered important legislation, including the Federal Emergency Relief Act, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the Tennessee Valley Authority, and the National Industrial Recovery Act. Launched with much fanfare, Roosevelt's boldest action was the creation of the National Recovery Administration. And this was led by General Hugh Johnson. Displays of the NRA Blue Eagle insignia were everywhere, at workplaces, in stores, and billboards. So the National Recovery Administration, the NRA, had this Blue Eagle symbols and insignia. The promotional parade at New York's Fifth Avenue was impressive, but the NRA's attempt to set up a corporatist combine to plan output and prices had a short life. In 1935, the Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional. Before Roosevelt's New Deal, it was common to see federal budgets with peacetime surpluses. A shift took place, symbolized by Roosevelt's redefinition of freedom, in the sense that government could guarantee economic security and prosperity. It became passé to define political freedom as freedom from the state. For conservatives, for free market economists, this reversal of thinking meant that the government was man's tender-hearted protector and provider rather than a potential enemy of freedom. The government had both the moral obligation and the competence to run the macroeconomy and guarantee its citizens' economic security. At least this was the ideal. This is what was hoped for. So the New Deal, there were three goals, notable goals, were provide relief for the needy, to provide economic recovery and financial reform. And his first 100 days, there was lots of activity, and the federal government expanded like never seen before. John Maynard Keynes had sent President Roosevelt a copy of his pamphlet, The Means to Prosperity. He also addressed the president in an open letter published in the New York Times in December of 1933. The first sentence revealed much. Quote, "You have made yourself the trustee for those in every country who seek to mend the evils of our condition by a reasoned experiment within the framework of existing social system." For Keynes, the alternate to Roosevelt's social reform was orthodoxy and revolution to fight it out. While he was critical of some of Roosevelt's policies, he sought to reassure the president. Quote, "You remain for me the ruler whose general outlook and attitude to the tasks of government are the most sympathetic in the world. You are the only one who sees the necessity of a profound change of methods and is attempting it without intolerance, tyranny, or destruction." According to Keynes, by making adaptations and enlargements to the New Deal, Roosevelt could put America on the road to recovery with full employment and give comfort to men's minds through restoration of their faith in the wisdom and the power of government. But Roosevelt's policies failed to return the economy to pre-Depression conditions. However, he effectively used his gift of speech and the radio to communicate both confidence and compassion to the American people. One historian writes, "Where Hoover had been brusque, Roosevelt inspired. His advisors were astonished at how convincing his broadcast sounded." The medium of the radio appeared to create a new reality, separate from the reality of old politics. If voters focused on the voice and the message and not the tardy recovery, that might carry the Democrats forward. And there is, quote, "a natural sympathy for the underdog, and the New Deal was a project undertaken in the name of the underdog." During the first 2 years of his presidency, that sense of compassion was translated into a new state of affairs between the federal government and the economy. This change was forged in the short-term provision of temporary work relief for the unemployment and their families, and the long-term recovery and reform of America's industry and financial institutions. Some aspects of the New Deal were inspiring. For example, the Civilian Conservation Corps created parks, bridges, and roads. But more disastrous was the National Recovery Administration. Its rules, quote, "were so stringent, they perversely hurt businesses. They frighten away capital, and they discourage employers from hiring workers." So again, unemployment remained to be quite dismal. Revisionist historians argue that Hoover and Roosevelt had much in common on economics. Paul Johnson claims that the Hoover-Roosevelt period was really a continuum, that most of the innovations of the New Deal were in fact expansions or intensifications of Hoover solutions or pseudo solutions, and that Roosevelt's administration differed from Herbert Hoover's in only two important respects. It was infinitely more successful in managing its public relations, and it spent rather more taxpayers' money. The continuum of policy made the slump more severe and prolonged difficult economic conditions to the end of the 1930s. Thank you.